Yeah, thanks, Corinne. I'm going to ask you about inflation. So yesterday in the Rose Garden, the president said that when he came into office, inflation was skyrocketing, but it was 1.4% in January of 2021, and that was the 11th consecutive month at that time under 2%. So was the president misleading Americans?
So when the president took office, and you know this, there was a pandemic. It was closing down businesses, closing down schools, and so it was drastically disrupting the supply chain. Let's not forget about that. And so that's what was going on, and that caused inflation around the world to increase. We know that, and then further increasing inflation was the Russia's war in Ukraine, and in fact, many other countries are even worse off because of what we've seen with Russia's war. So the president took historic action to deal with the disruption of the supply chain. Let's not forget what he did with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and so we have made progress in lowering costs. We've made progress in dealing with inflation, but that's what was happening when we walked in. The pandemic, the disruption of the supply chain, all of these things were happening when the president took office.
But the president didn't say the supply chain was being disrupted. He said inflation was skyrocketing.
But that's what he was referring to, right? That's what was going on. Those were the things that were happening right before us. The pandemic, it was taking thousands of lives a day when he took office. Schools were closed, majority of schools were closed. Businesses were closing. And we had a supply chain that was disrupted. And so that's what the president was speaking to and laying out. And then inflation down the road became even more, increased even more because of the war that Russia had taken on into Ukraine.
But the Fed supply chain measure actually went down in November at that time. So is the president being honest about inflation?
The president has said what he said what he saw when he took office. The pandemic was happening, right? It disrupted the supply chain. You know what happens when the supply chain is disrupted. You know what that leads to. And so that's what he was speaking to. And not only that, we also saw a war in Ukraine. That Mr. Putin, an aggression that Mr. Putin was putting into Ukraine, set forth. And so the president had to take historic action, take aggressive action in dealing with disruption in the supply chain. He released the Strategic Petroleum Reserve so that we can deal with the supply chain, and he continued to take action to lower cost. And that's what we've seen, whether it's healthcare costs, whether it's dealing with junk fees, whether it's prescription drugs, lowering those costs. That's what the president took action in. But we saw what was happening when the president took office. We did.